good. Yeah, good stuff. Oh, wow. Thanks, guys. Holding it down in the back. So today we are going to build a UI the way Facebook does it. Subtitle, React from First Concepts. I have to warn you guys, we are kind of boiling the ocean today because we're going to go from, there's something in programming called abstractions, and basically it's just easier ways to deal with complex subject matter. And we are basically dealing with abstraction on top of abstraction on top of abstraction. So I'm going to try and kind of start from base levels and build from there. But stop me if something is confusing, if you have a question, whatever. I kind of just want to get a feel, like in the room, what is your guys' experience with front-end technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript? Any answer is OK. If you would have asked me a little while ago, I would have said none. So, oh God, this guy. All right, so Kevin Mack is an expert. Anybody else an expert? OK, wait. Let's do this. Hold up a finger. So if you think you're don't know anything, you're a 1. If you maybe know some stuff, you're a 2. And then if you're Kevin Mack, hold up 3 fingers. So ready? 1, 2, 3. Whoa, there's some Kevin Macks. Oh, wow. That's what I want to be when I grow up. OK, so before we dive in, and that's cool. We have a good kind of mix of people in the room here, so I'm excited about this. So before we jump in, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about myself. Hi, I'm Kevin McCartney. Here are some of the things that I do. So I am a consultant over at Cardinal Solutions. I work with Kevin and Adam, who's right over there. He just waved. None of you can see that. I am also an application developer at Point. We are a startup that is trying to help businesses do well and do good by incentivizing their employees to get involved in their communities, just get out there, volunteer their time. It's a really cool emerging market. I help to organize a meetup called Creative Conception. We have not come up with a logo yet because we are about to do our second meetup, TBD. It was going to be next week, but I got really busy, so we might not do it. We might do it next month. But it's basically just a space for people to come together and talk about their ideas and get some really good constructive feedback. Basically a critique, like an art critique, writer's workshop, but for people who are making digital products. Maybe you're a designer, a web developer, just whatever you do, get together with some sharp people and get some feedback on your ideas. So I think it's really, I think it'll help you guys to understand how I got here and maybe kind of put you at ease with some of this subject matter if maybe this isn't your background. So I am an art school dropout. I was a graphic design student at OU, and I pissed off the guy who headed the department up and wrote the curriculum so bad that I was like, well, I'm not going to stay here to do this because I hate this guy and the curriculum that he wrote. So I decided to move out to California based on the advice of one of my trusted advisors. He was my art theory teacher, really sharp guy. His name is John Sabra. You should look him up. He paints using lead in river water. He's a really crazy dude. So John told me to go out to California. There may or may not have also been a girl involved in this situation. I will not say. Funny story, last time I did this in the dry run, she was there and felt very called out. So I'm glad she's not here today because she is still a very dear friend and I don't want to end that friendship. So once I was out in California, I was like, cool, I will finish my design degree, life will be great. But I had to pay the bills, so I got a job as a salesperson at a company that did websites for realtors. What I quickly found out is that I am a terrible salesperson. And so based on the advice of said girl, I decided to try to get into the development side of the company. That's me being a developer. I figured, hey, why not? It still was not really where my heart was. At that point, I wanted to basically be Tyler, the Creator, which is kind of weird where I'm at in life now. I don't feel like that anymore. But I decided, what the heck? It's good money. It's something creative. So I hit the books. I started making some projects. And after some hard work and some proof of concept, I eventually got accepted onto the development team there. And it turns out that I loved it. it's like my main passion in life now. So one of the things that I feel has been really huge for me in my career has been the power of free learning and community. It is awesome. Kevin Mack talked about this a lot earlier, but both of us, I'm sure, could talk your ear off about it. People getting together and sharing their knowledge and just building each other up is one of the most powerful things I think that you can do for somebody. So the other thing I think is really cool about building things for the web, building digital products, is that you have a lot of influence over the world that you live in. You can use your products to, promote peace, justice, equality, but you can also just use it to make somebody's day a little better. So there's a really wide range of what you can do. Kind of the world is your oyster. So I want to let you guys know what you can expect to get from this workshop. Since you're investing the time with me, I figure it's only fair to kind of give you guys an idea of what you're signing up for here. So you can run streaming if you want. That's always an option. So you're going to get a high-level understanding of how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript provide web apps for the browser to render. You're also going to get familiarity with core concepts and fundamentals of React. And if you sign up for CodePen, you will get a functional user interface implemented in React that you build. So let's get started. As I said, this is going to be super fast. We are boiling the ocean, and it'll be great. So again, just defining what we're doing on a high level today, we're building a functional UI component with React. Whenever you invest your time into something, I'm really time conscious because I don't have a lot of it. So I always freak out that I'm doing the wrong things, and I'm like, oh, is this actually going to be worth my time? So I think it's really instructive to look at why you're doing something. So I think there's two main elements here: why user interfaces, and I have a couple thoughts on that. First of all, great UIs are crucial to successful products. As Kevin was saying earlier, content is definitely king, and your product has to have a point, but it also has to have a way for users to interact with it, and they need to feel good about it. It's a challenge. I frequently say that the most challenging parts of my job are not the technical aspects. It's definitely the people part of it. It is the communication. It's just understanding the weird soft creatures that we are. That sounded really weird. Human. So the final thing is, it's definitely in demand. As we kind of enter this age of digital products, Kevin talked a lot about this, and I was born in 1992, so I haven't been in the game quite as long, but I definitely am super passionate about the field, and it's developing so fast. There's so much opportunity, and we get to have a hand in that. The other part of this is why React? And my slides are out of order. So you guys got a little preview there. But the first thing I think is it has a really vibrant community. I think that's super important. As I was saying earlier, technical stuff is cool. People are better. And React has a really cool community of passionate people that love to help each other out and are just really all about this product that they make. They want to make it better. They want to make it easier to use. They're just really all about it. It has some really good core concepts behind it. A few to name that you can look up later. React is mostly based on functional programming. So there's kind of two paradigms when it comes to programming. There is functional and imperative. Functional is more declarative. It's saying, here's what I want. And then there's usually an abstraction layer built that translates that into, OK, since I want this, do this. You can write code that just says, OK, if this, then this, moving stuff around. It goes into a lot of really obscure mathematics, but basically functional programming is much easier to reason about, and I think it's a lot more fun. You can also compose your interface. One of the things Kevin was talking a lot about is just that flexibility and just being able to kind of compose things out of smaller components makes it much easier to build a great user interface. There are also a couple of other more technical things like immutable data structures. So if you have immutable data, you can do things like travel through time. One of the really cool talks I've watched about React is the guy who did Redux talking about like his thought process as he was building this tool called Redux, which it kind of hooks into React, and it allows your state to be managed in such a way that you can kind of just take snapshots of it and use those snapshots throughout your application. So like, let's say you delete something and you're like, oh, I didn't want to do that. If you have a snapshot of your immutable data structure, you can just roll back to the last snapshot, and you're like, hey, there's my data. It's great. Another really big win you get is higher order components. And this is another kind of technical thing. I'm just kind of trying to throw out some concepts for you guys. Maybe if any of this sounds interesting, kind of Google it. That's what I did and continue to do throughout my career. I just find stuff that I don't understand and that seems interesting, so I kind of look into it. But basically, higher order components or higher order functions is basically a function that is returning another function. It gets pretty crazy. It's something you should definitely look up. You can also have incredibly granular control over your application state and, when should this render. Like I was saying, you can have a lot of control over what's being done with your data and so on. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of awesome developer tooling, and if you guys want to talk more about that, definitely down. There's a lot of really cool debuggers and inspectors that make it a lot easier to see what's going on within your React application. You can also do native application development with React Native if you come to the next workshop with Adam. I have had the pleasure of working on a React Native project, and it's been a lot of fun. You can write JavaScript that gets transpiled. So the code in JavaScript is taken, and it's basically transformed into either Java or Objective-C or Swift, things that run on native platforms like iPhones or Androids. React is also really good for SEO because you can render React on your server or on the browser. Today we're mostly going to be focusing on browser stuff, but it has the big win of what's called isomorphic rendering. Because you can run JavaScript both in the browser and on the server, you can pre-render your pages so that bots can still crawl them. And you get those awesome SEO wins. So React is also super fast. A lot of frameworks and tools have taken cues from React about how they have implemented their what's called a virtual DOM, which is, I'll kind of go into, but basically it's an abstraction layer over just writing plain HTML, JS, CSS, and it really helps to get some great performance out of your web app. But I've been talking a lot about web apps. So what actually is a web app? So a web app is an application that runs in your browser, right? You have things like iTunes or Microsoft Word that runs on your computer. And so your computer is the environment that that application is running in. And web apps are just applications, but they're running in a browser, like Chrome or Firefox, or if you're so inclined, Edge or Internet Explorer. I hope you're not, but some people are. So how is this done? The answer, and this is a little bit diving in a little deep here, but I'm going to kind of unpack some of this. So the browser reads the combined DOM and CSS object model generated by the HTML and CSS respectively. So DOM stands for Document Object Model. CSS OM, I don't know whether to call it like SOM or whatever. I have never heard the word said out loud, so I'm just going to go with CSS Object Model because that's how I feel comfortable saying it. But it's a similar data structure to the DOM that describes how things should be styled. And we're going to go into more of that in a few minutes here. But the browser also provides a runtime for JavaScript to execute. So in the same way that your phone might have a runtime or just a computer program that understands like Java code and can transform that Java code into the ones and zeros that like work on machines, the browser has a runtime for JavaScript. So it can take JavaScript instructions and make them into instructions for the computer. So we're going to look at some of the fundamental building blocks of web apps here. So first and most foundational is HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language. HTML is the building block of web pages. And what that does for you is it defines the structure and semantics of your web app. So HTML entities are delimited by opening and closing tags written with angle brackets and a slash, which is a very confusing way to say this. So an HTML tag has what's called an opening tag right here. All of this between the first two brackets, and then a closing tag there with the little slash in between the two brackets. And it can have things like attributes. So this href is an attribute that has a value of google.com. And then it has content that says, click here. So I'm going to give you an example here. And I don't know why that is showing up that way. But basically, right here is two HTML tags. And right here, we have two head tags, which is just used to hold metadata for your web app. The title tag, which says My Cool Web App, that would be the part that shows up in your browser's bar there, like the very top bar. And then it has the body with an h1 that says Hello World, and it has an attribute of class that says My Class. Class is going to get important when we go into CSS. We also have an a tag here with a similar href and link. So how that looks on the browser is this. So the h1 tag is just saying, here's a heading. The a tag is just saying, here's a link. When you click on that link, it takes you to Google. Pretty simple stuff. Where it gets really cool is when we introduce the DOM. So the DOM is the document object model. It's an object that represents HTML tags as nodes in a tree based on the structure of the HTML document. You're going to hear a lot about nodes and trees. Basically, it's just a way of structuring data. A node is an item in a tree, and they're all connected. And it's a little simpler when you get to kind of see it visually. So for that example I just showed you, this is the DOM tree. So it has an HTML element at the root. It has the head and the body. The head has the title node. The body has the a tag and the h1 nodes. And that's the DOM. It's just an object representing what's on your browser screen. Now let's talk about CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. What it does is it defines the visual styles and layouts. It's also inherited. So CSS styles flow from the parent down to the child. That is the cascading part. We're going to go over a quick example here. So here's an example. So I have here what are called CSS rules. And this right here, the word body is a selector. So that's saying here is the DOM node that I want to target. And then it has the font family and sans serif. So that's saying that on the body, I want any text that shows up to be a sans serif font, right? And then we also have down here for your a tag, the little link tag we had, it's telling it that that font style should be italic. The reason I skipped over the second one here is this one is the class selector, which is a little bit more complicated. But remember how we had the class attribute on that h1 node? That is what this is targeting right here. So it's saying that it should be a red color, and it should have a margin on the top of it of 100 pixels. When the DOM and the CSS object model are merged together in the browser, it looks a little something like this. So now you can see your text is all sans serif. Your title is red and a little bit down. And this is italicized, your little a tag there. So I already talked about the CSS object model a little bit here. But just to kind of flesh out that explanation, the CSS object model is an object similar to the DOM that I think I wrote that wrong. That structures CSS rules as nodes in a tree based on the structure of the CSS style sheet. Again, that's kind of a difficult way to say this. So we have an HTML element. We have the head. We have the title. We didn't put any CSS on any of that. So remember, we put on the body, the font family is sans serif. And then we have our styles down here for the h1 with the class of my class and the a node right there. The thing to notice is that these two nodes right here are inheriting the sans serif font family from the body. That is the inheritance or the cascade of CSS. So from the CSS object model tree, you can see that once a property has been defined at a parent object, the property is inherited by all the child objects. And the final part of a web app is JavaScript, which is what we're going to be interacting mostly with here today. So JavaScript is a programming language, and what that means is it's simply a set of instructions for a computer. JavaScript runs in a VM in the browser or server, And a VM is a virtual machine. That's something you can kind of look up a little bit more now. Basically, what you can take that to mean is that it's almost like a complete operating system, but it operates within another operating system. It's, I don't know, it's like that Pimp My Ride thing where he's like, yo, I heard you like operating systems, so you can have an operating system in your operating system. But yeah, I should have put that in there. That would have been funnier if I would have put that in my deck. So JavaScript can use logic to mutate the DOM and the CSS object model, as well as perform other functions such as network requests. Now, we are going to go over this at a pretty lightning speed because we could talk about JavaScript for days. But here are a few things that you should know about JavaScript. Just a few like kind of vocabulary things I'm going to be using throughout this talk. So an expression is simply a piece of JavaScript that is a value. An example would be here. I have a variable, and the value is a value. Everything on the right here is an expression. It's just a string or a set of letters that forms a sentence, and that is an expression. And then I'm going to explain a little bit about const here. So you guys might have seen another way of defining a variable. You can write like var my variable. And this is a new ES6 feature. ES6 is a new spec for JavaScript, which basically just means that you get more features and different syntaxes. It's just an update of the language, and it's pretty cool. So it's a way of assigning and storing a value. And the const part of it stands for like constant. It means it's not going to change. So when we look at this snippet of code again, what I'm saying, this thing right here, this variable, const variable, is holding this value, and it's not going to change. So when I refer to variable in my code, it's going to know that it actually means a value because variable is holding that value right there. So next thing we need to talk about real quick are objects. So objects are a data structure, which is just a fancy way of saying a way to store data. Objects can have multiple items that are comma delimited. Each item has a key and a value. And here is an example of an object. So everything here, this is the object. And it's being assigned to a variable called object with that const keyword, so we know that it's not going to change. So here we have a key that is value 1, and then the value here, which says, I'm a value. You can also do things like nest objects within objects, which is what value 3 is here. So value 3, if you go to value 3.2, it says, I'm the second nested value. And the way that you can access these pieces of information or these values is by referring to the variable and then just using a dot to signify which key that you want to access. And you can do that even for like super nested items. So like object, value 3, value 3.1, I'm the first nested value, would be referring to this value here. And you're just kind of walking down the tree by using this dot notation. So functions. We need to talk about functions. And functions are a self-contained block of JavaScript that can be called at any time. They can return a value, and they can take parameters that can be used in the body of the function. This is a lot clearer when we take a look at a piece of code here. So this is a function called example function. It takes a parameter here called greeting. And then in the body of the function, which is everything between the two curly braces, it's saying here that there is a variable called message that takes the greeting, which is the input, and then appends that to the string that says, I'm a function. So, and then it's returning the message. That's the value that it's returning. So if you call this right here with example function and you pass in the value hello, it's taking that, appending it, or prepending it really to that string and then returning it. So then it says, hello, I'm a function. This is probably the bread and butter of JavaScript. JavaScript is a mostly functional language, but I'm going to talk really quickly about classes here. So the first thing to know is that JavaScript does not have real classes. The class syntax is what's called syntactical sugar. And basically what that means is that it is an abstraction over something that's more difficult to understand. And so we're just kind of hiding that away in a way that is in a way that's safe, in a way that's logical, but it helps us to write code faster and easier. JavaScript is a prototypical language, so it's a little bit different than a class-based language or an object-oriented language. That's, again, something you guys can kind of dig into a little later, but just so you know, JavaScript really doesn't have true classes. It's kind of a wrapper over some deeper functionality. But a mental model helpful to understand classes is just to think of them as fancy objects. So a class can hold values and functions. And functions that belong to a class are called methods. So if you look at this right here, this kind of example class, my class extends parent class. What that extends words mean is that there's another class called parent class that this class is also kind of getting some information from. And it doesn't really matter what that parent class is for the kind of purposes of this illustration. But a couple of things I want to call out here. So this function right here, or rather this method called constructor, is something that is called immediately when this new instance of my class is instantiated or made. And what the constructor basically says is that once this new instance of my class is made, then you're going to assign the a number value to the class as 4, and a string is hello world. And we also have another method here called add numbers that can take 2 parameters and then just returns the sum of them. So here on line 12, we are saying const new instance, so assigning a variable, and then the value is a new my class. So we're creating a new instance of this class right here and assigning that value to the variable new instance. And then you can access things with the standard dot notation. So new instance dot a string is hello world. New instance add numbers 5 and 6. 5 and 6 is 11, so you get the value 11 right there. I already kind of went into constructors here, but basically it's a way of saying that whenever a new class is called or instantiated, it should have a certain set of values. And I'm going to briefly, oh, sorry, do we have a question? Yeah. Can you do the mic?
For the add method, you did not have the word function in front of it. Is there a difference between when you should have the word function in front of a method?
That's actually a really good question. So when you use the keyword function outside of a class, you have to use the word function to say, OK, this is a function. When you use this syntax right here, where it's like a word and then the 2 like little parentheses, when it's inside a class, the class just knows that that is a function or a method. Yeah, and I think you actually can write out the function keyword there. It's generally accepted that you don't, but it's probably good to do so if that makes your code easier to reason about. So real quick, I just want to touch on this. This is a keyword, and it's really, really confusing. You could talk for days and days about it. But really what you need to know is, for the purposes of today, this is simply referring to the class that is currently enclosing the expression. Real quick, we're going to go over if-else. If-else is a flow control structure. So what that means is flow control is a way of implementing logic into your application. And I thought that I had an example there. But basically, what you can say is, if this is true, then do this. If it's not true, do that. And then destructuring. Destructuring is a way of accessing and assigning variables. So here's an example of destructuring. It's just a syntax kind of thing. So down here, we have this const value. So we know that we're assigning a variable to a value here, or a value to a variable. So this right here, this object, so it's object deeply nested value. That's 4 levels of basically nestedness. And when you're using a destructuring syntax, then you can just refer to everything up to the value that you want to return. So it knows object deeply nested, and then grabbing the value from that right there. So that was kind of a whirlwind, and you guys don't have to like commit all of this to memory. Like I said, this is like boiling the ocean times 1,000. But I just wanted you guys to be kind of familiar with some of the things that were the phrases and concepts that we're talking about as we go through this workshop. So here are some of the fundamentals of React. Some of the core concepts include unidirectional data flow, components, props and state. Components have a life cycle. There are container and presentational components, and something called JSX. We're going to go over these real quick, and you guys will see a lot of examples of them later. So unidirectional data flow just means that data flows from the top of the application tree to the bottom. This makes it really easy to understand our applications. And two-way data binding, you're going to get some different opinions here, but in general, I consider it to be pretty bad because you're not really, it's not as easy to reason about. It could possibly bring more bugs into your program, lots of bad stuff. So we'll see a lot of examples of unidirectional data flow as we walk through the exercise. One of the really big ones is components. Components are just a way to encapsulate pieces of the DOM. So components can hold markup, which is just HTML. It can also hold state, which is just kind of pieces of data that you are attaching to that component, and functions, which, as we said, can be referred to as methods when they're inside of a component or a class. So here's an example here, and this is actual React. So this here is a class called myComponent that extends the React base component. That's just saying, OK, React has provided us this little component, and we want to inherit everything that that component does and do some stuff on top of it. So we're calling the constructor here. Basically, this is just a React idiom so that if you need to access any of the props, which we'll talk about in a second, you can do that. The super refers to the parent class of the class that is currently being created. So right here, we have a method called render message, and it returns a value hello world. And then here down at the bottom is the render method for this class. And this is kind of a special React thing. Whenever you call render, then it's going to put that piece of information, that component that you've defined, into the DOM. So it's returning div class name component item, and then we're calling this method right here, this render message, which is returning hello world. So what that looks like in the browser is simply this. It's just a title that says hello world. We're going to go into props and state. This is some really foundational, super important stuff for you guys to understand when working with React. So props and state are pieces of data that are attached to a component, as I said. The difference is props are read-only, and they have to be passed from a parent component to a child component. And state can only be created and mutated or changed by the component that it belongs to. So this is a slightly longer example here that is kind of cut off at the top. But here it says, basically, this is parent component extends React component. And then this one should be called child component. But basically, what this is doing is it's just rendering. And we are defining a prop up here. This is the important part. So we are saying my prop is equal to the string I'm a prop. And then we are returning the child component here. As I said, this should be called child component. I totally goofed on that. But we're assigning the my prop as the value here. So this is a prop. You're just passing an attribute into a child component. And then here with the child class, we're calling the constructor. And we are, when this is instantiated, we want to set a piece of state for this child component saying, hey, I'm a piece of state. And then when we render, we're using the destructuring syntax. So we're accessing the myState and myProp variables from the state and the props respectively. And then we're returning a div with two titles in it, one that says I'm a prop and one that says I'm a piece of state, which is going to look a little something like this. So components also have a life cycle. Component life cycle methods are a way to mutate the component at certain points or to change your component at certain points in the component's time in the DOM, time in the browser. And component lifecycle methods fall into three main categories. So you can call a component lifecycle method when an item is mounting, when it's updating, or when it's unmounting. And I'm going to go through those really quickly here. So mounting is basically like when you're putting something into the browser on the DOM, these are where your mounting lifecycle methods are going to be. So as we said, the constructor is always going to be the method that's going to be called first. There's also a lifecycle hook called component will mount. So that's saying before we render this into the browser, do whatever is in this method. Then there's the render method, which we've already gone over, and component did mount. So it says once it's in the browser, what do we do now? There's also updating lifecycle methods. So when the component changes based on the states of the prop, then these are going to be able to hook into the component and change whatever's going on in there. So we can use component will receive props for when we know that a child component is going to get some new state from a parent component. This one is called should component update, and it's a bit of a weird one because it's basically allowing you to say, do I want this component to update or not based on the data that it's receiving. It is kind of on a deprecation track to my understanding, but which means that it probably will not be around super long. I have never used it. Component will update is just saying, OK, we know that the component is going to get some different data. So what do we want to do before it gets that data? Obviously, the render method again, and then component did update. So once that component has received that new data, what do we want to do? And this one is actually, it should be unmounting lifecycle. So component will unmount is basically just saying once this is going to get removed from the DOM, what do we want to do about it? And the final concept here is JSX. So JSX is an extension of HTML. You can embed JavaScript in JSX, and you can also treat JSX as an expression. And that's what you've been looking at the whole time here. So this right here is a JSX expression. It's allowing you to write HTML in your JavaScript so that you can, have that more fine-grained control over your UI. So it's going to be time to code. For those of you who signed up for CodePen and Fourth of First Pen, let's go ahead and get started here. For everybody else, like if you just want to watch or just kind of hang out and see what's going on, also cool. So what I have here is a little social network here. So it has a title. It has a little card here that says hello world. And we have some CSS here. Since this is not really a CSS section, I'm not going to go over it a whole lot. But just safe to say, we are applying some styles to this HTML that's being rendered by the JavaScript here. So I'm going to walk through this real quick here just to show where we're at on this first step. So we're defining a variable called feed item data, and that's going to come into play later. Right now I'm just saying nothing yet, nothing happening. And here I'm defining a component called app. I'm initializing it with that constructor function we went over. And I am setting the initial state of this component. The data state of this component is going to be feed item data, which is nothing yet. And then I am rendering the application in the feed item. So here we're calling the render method. It's returning this, just all this JSX here, or HTML sort of. So it's just returning basically the boxes that all the data is going to live in here. It's returning this, this heading. It's returning this hello world string. Pretty simple stuff. And then once we get down here, this is the way that React renders stuff into the DOM. It's a separate library called react.dom.render, which does pretty much what you would expect it to do. It's taking this app component that we defined up at the top, and then it's saying, for the HTML document, get that item by the ID of React root, and let's do our React stuff in there. So I just have a div that has a ID of React root. So this is our starting point. This is like the very, very first kind of place that we want to go from. So I'm going to kind of be flipping through here between. So this is going to be our second step. And I'm going to kind of explain to you guys what is going on here. So we have a lot of the same stuff. The big thing that we're doing here is we are, oh wait, this is still step one. Ha, I will have to go to step two here. So this is where you find everything, the collections, the React workshop. So here in step two, I am putting some actual data into this feed item data. So this is going to be what we're going to construct our UI component out of. So there's a message here using hipster ipsum. There is a user object which has a full name, a username, and then a URL for an avatar. And I believe that that's all that we're doing here. We still have the same app component. It's still setting its initial state to the feed item data, but now that has actual data inside of it. And then we are rendering into the DOM here. Another thing we're doing here is this right here. Whenever you see something that looks like HTML but has a capital letter for the beginning of it, feed item, that's another component here. And we're passing the data prop as the data that is the state of this parent component. So the parent component has the data inside of its state. We're destructuring that data out of the state here in the render method. And then we're saying, hey, we want to pass that data into the feed item, which is a child component. And we're defining the child component right here in much the same way, calling that constructor, and then setting up the state to say, okay, when this is instantiated, we want to make sure that the data in the state of this child component is the data that's being passed down to it. And then I have a method right here that is render feed item that is returning just a string that says hello world. So everything looks the same as the first step here from kind of a base level, but we're setting up some stuff that's going to really give us some big wins down the road. So we're calling the render method, saying that for the data, we want to make sure that it is at least that we have that information, even if we're not going to use it right now. And we are calling the method to render the feed item, which is returning that hello world string. And I'm kind of looking at the time since we've been running behind. I think I might actually just kind of run through line by line like what's going on here because I'm a slow typer. So I'm just going to kind of run you through this step by step. So now in step 3, we have some data. We have a parent and a child component, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier. So the parent component is the one that has the data. The child component is just like, okay, I have data that's being passed down into me, and then I'll render it. So in this step here, we have the same application here. We have the feed item, the render feed. Oh, that's weird. That should be doing something more. Well, we're going to go onwards and upwards to step 4 here. So this right here, now you can see everything's kind of in that component. And we are just rendering based on all the data here that's being passed in. So we still have our app component that's passing the data into the feed item. So what we're doing different here is we're actually using that data that we've received. So we're saying the avatar, the full name, and the username of the user that's being passed in. We're capturing all those values. We're also capturing the message of the data. And then we are just plugging it in here. So everything between these curly braces is a JavaScript expression. So it's these variables that equate to a value. And that's how we're rendering everything in here. So you have like the full name of the cat, which is a cat, and it's right there. He has his username, which is meow meow. And we have the message. We also have an avatar. And then we're just rendering it right here. And for the final step here, what we're doing is we're adding a little bit of interaction to this element. So if you see right here, we have a little like button. And then when you click it, it just turns red, and it says that there's a like. So you guys have seen this functionality a million different places, Twitter, Facebook, whatever. So how we're doing that under the hood is we're doing it all in the feed item data child. There's a child component here called like button, which is just this right here, this little heart and number. And so I'm going to go down here. So this like button component is just the third child component, and it's being constructed. It's saying that it's going to be initialized with the state saying, okay, it's not liked, and it doesn't have any likes when it's first rendered into the browser. And then there's a method here called toggle like. So this is what's doing the heavy lifting for this component. So it's pulling out the liked and the likes data out of the state. And this right here is the flow control I was talking about earlier. So if liked and likes, this is probably something I could have written out a little bit more verbosely, but basically with JavaScript, if a variable has a value, then it's considered to be what is called truthy. So if something has a value, then we're assuming that it's usable. So if liked and likes has a value that's usable, then we're going to set the state back to it being false and having no likes, because that would mean that we had already clicked it. If it doesn't, then we're setting it to say that, yeah, we liked it and it has 1 like. False and 0 are both falsy values, since we kind of consider that that's not like something they can use, which is a very broad generalization of truthy and falsy values, but it's one that's going to work for us for today. So then we're rendering the component here. And if the state of this component is liked, then we're adding a class on there that says liked. That's something that the CSS can look at to make the button red. And then here is the like wrapper, which is just the DOM node that's holding this whole little button thing. And it has something on here called onClick, which is a method that you can use on a DOM node. So it says, when you click on something, then do this. And we're calling the toggle like when this item is clicked on. So when I click here, it's toggling the like on or off. And then we're just rendering in a little icon and how many likes that this component has. So I know I kind of sold you all a false bill of goods here because we did not do any live coding, but I think that you can still kind of see some of the high-level concepts of React and like kind of where it's cool. Just some neat stuff you can do with it. So I am going to pull up the deck. It is not time to code anymore. It was never time to code. So I just really quickly want to go over some next steps. So online resources. If you guys think maybe this is something cool that I would want to kind of start to get into, there's some really cool stuff that you can do online. You know, the cool thing about being a web developer is we essentially build the platform that we can share all of our knowledge on. So you can go to Free Code Camp. Free Code Camp is awesome. MDN, which is Mozilla Developer Network, it's a little bit more of a reference material. Free Code Camp is like almost a coding boot camp. So they walk you through everything in a lot more detail than I did. But you can also reference MDN. So if you're saying like, okay, what can I do with this DOM node? You can look it up on MDN, and they'll give you like a complete reference of all the stuff you can do. Egghead.io is another great source for tutorials. It has a lot of tutorials with people who've like worked on React and Redux and other kind of React community projects. Front-End Masters is another really good one. This book, You Don't Know JavaScript by Kyle Simpson, is free on GitHub, and it is one of the best books on JavaScript I have ever read, ever. Maybe one of the best books on programming. He's a really sharp guy. And finally, documentation. I am really a big fan of reading documentation. So if you're looking at a project, you're like, hey, I want to use this, a really good thing to do is just to kind of look over the docs, because the people who wrote that piece of software are going to be able to tell you how best to use it. Another thing that you can do, which I think is super huge, is get involved. As Kevin was saying, there's Columbus Web Group, and that is definitely a resource and a space for people who are still in high school, people who are transitioning in their career, just anybody. Another cool thing in town is Girl Develop It. I have not met the organizer yet, but we've like passed a few times like very closely, and I've been dying to talk to her. It's really cool. It's a space for, in particular, girls to kind of start learning web development and getting their feet wet in a space that is specifically geared towards them. Also, find a mentor. This can be informal, formal, whatever. Columbus Web Group actually has a program that is all based around mentorship, but it can even be as simple as you getting together with a friend and saying, hey, I'm going to study this week, and then I'll teach you about it, and you study this week, and you teach me about what you learned. Reactive Flux is a really cool online community for people who are doing React. I like to talk to a lot of developers on Twitter, and I don't do as much, but I know Reddit is like cool and people talk on there and stuff. But also, keep in touch. I love talking to people. I love interacting and teaching and just helping out the community, because that's really what has been my story. So I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm just Kevin McCartney. My personal website, kevinmccartney.is, which is not a great communication tool, but it's kind of fun to look at. You can also email me, hello@kevinmccartney.is. And finally, thank you so much. I know this was kind of a wild ride. We covered a lot of ground, and hopefully this is just a springboard for you guys. If any of this seems interested, come up and talk to me, look it up on the internet, shoot me an email, hit me up on Twitter, whatever. Thank you so much. You guys have been great.